They didn't just kill my apple trees. They tried to erase my future so wealthy tourists could enjoy a better view from their luxury cabins. 3 years later, the only thing standing on that hillside was an abandoned construction site with weeds growing through unfinished foundations, and not a single paying guest had ever walked through its front gate. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if the man who made that decision understood that a few gallons of herbicide would eventually destroy an entire multi-million-dollar resort. Because if he had known where that first spray would lead, I honestly think he might have left my orchard alone. My name is Daniel Harper, and for most of my life, the smell of apple blossoms in early spring told me everything was going to be all right. My father planted the first rows on our land back in the early 90s after the old dairy business stopped making enough money to survive. Folks around here thought he was crazy. Apples took patience, years before they paid for themselves, and farming has never rewarded impatient people. But Dad always said trees teach you something people forget: the best things in life grow slowly. When he passed away, the orchard became mine. 18 acres spread across a gentle hillside overlooking one of the prettiest valleys you'd ever see. Every season had its own rhythm: winter pruning, spring blossoms, summer irrigation, fall harvest. The trees weren't just part of the landscape, they were family history rooted in the ground. I knew almost every row by heart. I could tell which trees produced the sweetest fruit, which ones needed a little extra care after a dry summer, and which branches my daughter used to climb before she left for college. That's the funny thing about orchards. People think they're looking at trees, but the owner sees birthdays, anniversaries, hard years, good years, and thousands of quiet mornings spent believing honest work still meant something. The property above mine sat empty for decades until a development company bought it one spring. Before long, survey stakes appeared, heavy equipment rolled in, and signs announced Cedar Ridge Retreat, a luxury destination featuring boutique cabins, a spa, hiking trails, and what they proudly advertised as unmatched panoramic valley views. I remember standing at my fence one evening reading the billboard while one of my neighbors, old Charlie Benson, walked over carrying a cup of coffee. He chuckled and said, "Looks like rich folks finally discovered this hill." I laughed too. Long as they stay on their side, we're all right. At the time, I believed that. A couple of weeks later, I met their development director. His name wasn't Preston anymore. Around here, everyone came to know him as Gavin Mercer. Mid-40s maybe, expensive hiking boots that had probably never seen mud, pressed jeans, designer sunglasses even though the sun was behind clouds. He climbed out of a spotless black pickup and introduced himself with one of those firm handshakes business people practice in front of mirrors. "Daniel, we're excited to be your new neighbors. Welcome to the valley," I told him. "Hope construction goes smoothly." He smiled while looking past me instead of at me. His eyes drifted across my orchard toward the valley below. "You've got one incredible view from here," he said. "Our guests are going to love waking up to this every morning." I nodded. "It's why my dad planted here." He laughed softly. "Well, if a few of those lower trees weren't in the way, you'd probably see twice as far." He said it like a joke, almost casual, but something about the way he kept staring downhill stayed with me longer than I expected. I answered with a smile anyway. "Those trees pay my mortgage." He shrugged. "Business is always about trade-offs." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. Charlie wandered over later that afternoon after seeing the conversation from across the road. "Something about that fellow rubs me wrong," he muttered. "Maybe I'm just getting old." I remember laughing it off. Developers always talk differently than farmers. One measured value by quarterly reports, the other by harvest seasons. I figured we'd simply stay out of each other's way. Summer arrived, and everything looked normal until one Tuesday morning when I noticed a patch of leaves near the upper edge of the orchard turning an odd shade of brown. At first, I blamed the heat. We'd had several unusually warm weeks without much rain. 2 days later, another tree showed the same symptoms. Then another. Healthy green leaves suddenly curled inward as though they had been scorched overnight. The fruit stopped growing. Small branches became brittle enough to snap with almost no pressure. I remember kneeling beside one trunk, rubbing the bark between my fingers, trying to convince myself it was some fungus I'd never seen before. Farmers spend their lives solving problems. You don't panic over every sick plant because nature has 1,000 ways of testing your patience. But something about this felt wrong. It wasn't spreading randomly. It was following a line. almost as if someone had drawn an invisible border across the top of my orchard. I called an arborist named Melissa Grant, someone I'd trusted for years whenever disease showed up in neighboring farms. She spent nearly 6 hours walking the property, digging around roots, clipping leaves into sample bags, checking soil moisture, even smelling the bark in places. Before she left, she stood quietly near the fence separating my land from the construction site. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I'm not ready to guess yet, but I don't think this is natural." Those words stayed with me every minute of the next 2 weeks while we waited for laboratory results, and deep down, although I couldn't explain why, I already had a feeling that the worst part of this story hadn't happened yet. When Melissa called, I could tell from the silence before she spoke that whatever she was about to say wasn't going to be good news. "Daniel," she said, "the lab finished the analysis. This isn't a fungus, it isn't drought stress, and it definitely isn't something your trees did on their own." I leaned against the kitchen counter without realizing it. "Just tell me." She took a slow breath. "The soil contains a concentrated herbicide. A strong one. Strong enough to kill mature, deep-rooted trees. And based on the concentration, it was applied recently." For a second I didn't answer. I just stared out the window toward the orchard where my father had spent years planting trees one by one. Trees my daughter had climbed as a little girl. Trees that had carried my family through recessions, bad harvests, and every unexpected bill life threw our way. "Are you sure?" I finally asked. I wish I wasn't. That afternoon, I walked the entire upper fence line by myself. Once I stopped looking at the orchard and started looking beyond it, things became impossible to ignore. The construction company had stripped almost everything off their hillside. Brush was gone. Young saplings were gone. Fresh dirt stretched across the slope like someone had shaved the hill clean. Then I noticed something else. The dying trees weren't scattered randomly. They followed the property line almost perfectly, except the damage continued several feet onto my side. I crouched down and ran my hand across the soil. Even without laboratory equipment, something felt wrong. It smelled faintly chemical after a light rain the night before. I took photographs from every angle, then climbed onto the old hay wagon near the fence and photographed the construction site from above. The pattern became even clearer. Whatever had been sprayed hadn't stopped where their land ended. It had drifted directly into the first several rows of my orchard. By sunset, I counted 25 trees showing severe damage, 10 of them already beyond saving. I called Gavin before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the third ring. "Daniel, what's going on?" His voice sounded rushed, almost irritated. "The lab found herbicide in my orchard." There was a pause. "Okay, not a little. Enough to kill mature apple trees." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, we've had some vegetation management done on our side. Your spray crossed onto mine. That happens sometimes." I gripped the phone tighter. 25 producing trees are dying. "I'll check with the landscaping contractor." "That's all you've got?" "Daniel, I'm in the middle of a meeting. You poisoned part of my livelihood." His voice cooled noticeably. "Let's not use words like poisoned until we know exactly what happened." Then he ended the call. I stood there listening to the disconnected tone longer than I probably should have. It wasn't just what he said. It was how easily he said it. As though losing trees that had taken decades to mature was no different than replacing flowers outside a hotel lobby. Charlie came over later carrying 2 coffees. He took one look at my face and didn't ask many questions. "That bad?" I nodded. We walked the fence together. "See that?" I pointed toward the bare construction slope. Charlie squinted. "Looks like they sprayed everything, including my side." He shook his head slowly. "You need a lawyer." The next morning I drove into town and met with an attorney named Rebecca Collins. She had represented farmers for nearly 20 years and had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions that usually uncovered uncomfortable answers. I spread everything across her conference table: photographs, laboratory reports, property surveys, harvest records, tax documents showing orchard income going back years. She barely interrupted while I explained everything. When I finished, she read Melissa's report a second time, then looked up at me. "Daniel, accidental overspray usually looks random. Wind carries droplets in uneven directions." She slid one photograph toward me. "This doesn't look random." "That's what Melissa said." Rebecca nodded. "This looks systematic." She asked if I'd changed anything on the property recently. Different chemicals, different irrigation, new fertilizer. The answer was no every time. Finally, she leaned back. I think we need independent testing immediately. Within 48 hours, another certified environmental consultant was walking my orchard with GPS equipment, taking dozens of soil samples, and carefully marking every collection point on a digital map. Rebecca insisted on documenting everything before anyone had the chance to argue the evidence had changed. While the testing continued, she quietly started requesting public records connected to Cedar Ridge Retreat. Building permits, environmental reviews, site plans, stormwater reports, chemical handling documents, anything filed with the county. Developers leave paper trails, she told me. Sometimes those trails tell a better story than witnesses do. A week later, she called me into her office again. The new laboratory results matched Melissa's almost exactly. The contamination line mirrored the uphill property boundary with remarkable consistency. Rebecca spread the maps across her desk. Look at this. She traced one finger across the samples. Highest concentration here, then gradually weaker as it moves downhill into your orchard. I frowned. Meaning whoever applied it wasn't trying to treat your trees directly. Then what were they trying to do? She looked me straight in the eye. Clear everything growing near the property line. I remembered Gavin standing beside his truck talking about the view. If a few of those lower trees weren't in the way. At the time, it sounded like casual conversation. Sitting in Rebecca's office, it sounded very different. She didn't accuse anyone outright. She didn't have to. Instead, she filed formal notices preserving evidence, contacted the State Agriculture Division, and requested an official investigation. Let the government collect its own samples, she said. Independent findings carry weight no private expert can match. For days later, 2 investigators arrived wearing state field jackets with clipboards tucked under their arms. They spent nearly 8 hours examining both properties. They photographed vegetation, measured distances, inspected drainage paths, and quietly asked questions that Gavin's construction superintendent seemed increasingly uncomfortable answering. I watched from my side of the fence while one investigator pointed toward the freshly cleared hillside and another carefully marked locations with bright orange flags. Gavin showed up halfway through the inspection. Even from a distance, I could tell he wasn't happy. He marched toward the investigators, talking with exaggerated hand gestures before finally noticing me standing near the orchard. For just a second, our eyes met across the fence. Neither of us waved. Neither of us smiled. Something had changed. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors anymore. It had become an investigation, and whether Gavin realized it or not, the questions were only beginning. The official report took another 9 days to arrive, and those were probably the longest 9 days of my life. Farming teaches patience, but patience feels different when you're watching trees that took decades to mature slowly give up one leaf at a time. Every morning, I'd walk the same rows with a cup of coffee, hoping somehow the damage would stop where it was. It didn't. Then Rebecca called. She didn't waste time with small talk. Daniel, the state finished its investigation. You need to come to my office. When I walked in, the report was already sitting on the conference table. She slid it toward me without saying a word. I only needed to read the first page. The investigators concluded the herbicide application pattern was inconsistent with ordinary brush control and consistent with a commercial-scale land clearing operation that had extended beyond the permitted work area. More importantly, the report noted elevated chemical residue near the seasonal creek that separated part of the 2 properties. Rebecca tapped that paragraph with her pen. This changes everything. Within days, the county environmental office collected water samples upstream and downstream. The upstream samples came back clean. The downstream samples didn't. That one difference started a chain reaction nobody at Cedar Ridge Retreat seemed prepared for. Construction inspectors posted a stop work order at the entrance. State environmental officials arrived with more trucks, more testing equipment, and more questions. The developers tried to argue that an outside contractor had made a mistake, but every agency gave them the same answer. The permit holder was responsible for work performed on the project. Responsibility couldn't simply be subcontracted away. I saw Gavin one last time a few weeks later. He spotted me while I was loading irrigation pipe into my truck outside the local feed store. He walked over looking 10 years older than the man who had first introduced himself at my fence. You happy now? He asked. I looked at him for a moment before answering. Happy? No. I'd rather still have my trees. He shook his head. This project would have brought jobs. Then it should have been built the right way. He laughed without any humor. You're really going to let this destroy the whole development? I met his eyes. I didn't spray the hillside. For the first time since we'd met, he didn't have a comeback. He simply turned around and walked away. After that, events moved faster than anyone expected. Investors became nervous. Lenders wanted answers. Cleanup estimates kept climbing as contaminated soil had to be removed from sensitive areas and disturbed sections of the site required restoration under agency supervision. Construction equipment disappeared one piece at a time until only half-finished buildings remained overlooking the valley they had wanted so badly to showcase. Eventually, the civil case ended in a negotiated settlement that covered a substantial portion of the orchard's losses and future restoration costs. No amount of money replaced trees that had taken decades to grow, but it gave me a chance to plant again instead of walking away. The following spring, my daughter came home for a weekend and helped me set the first new saplings into the ground. She smiled and said, "Dad, Grandpa would have liked this." I smiled back. He would have reminded us that orchards are built for the next generation, not the last one. Today, if you drive past my property in the spring, you'll still see rows of older trees bursting with blossoms, and between them you'll notice younger ones stretching toward the sky. They have a long way to go, but that's all right. Good things always do. If you look farther up the hill, you'll find unfinished foundations slowly disappearing beneath tall grass. Nature has a funny way of reclaiming places where people forget to respect it. Sometimes folks ask me if I ever felt like I won. The truth is, I don't think anybody really wins when land is damaged. I lost trees my father planted with his own hands. Workers lost jobs they thought would last for years. Investors lost money. A community lost a project that might have succeeded if better decisions had been made from the beginning. But I do believe something important survived. The idea that property lines matter. That shortcuts can become the longest road of all. And that treating a neighbor's livelihood as an obstacle instead of something worth respecting can cost far more than anyone imagines. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted an apology and a settlement early on, or would you have pushed the investigation as far as the law allowed? And if you were standing in Gavin's shoes, do you think this was reckless negligence or a calculated gamble that simply backfired? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between an honest mistake and a choice that deserves every consequence that follows. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story about ordinary people standing their ground when doing the right thing turns out to be the hardest path of all.